Kia ora. RNZ has just posted an article on a successful Te Atiawa project to build a set of high-end townhouses close to the CBD in New Plymouth, where colonial troops once assembled for inspection. It is part of their ongoing plan to also supply quality accommodation for their own people. And one of these apartments was purchased by a descendant of a soldier in the British regiment that had occupied the area in the 1860s. This was a really positive announcement, given the early history of Taranaki. After all the early conflict, the disputes over land, the wars, and subsequent confiscations of land, and the mutual distrust and hatred that poisoned Māori-Pākehā relations for generations, we finally see Taranaki Māori fulfilling their potential. It's taken over 180 years, but this is a beautiful example of what the Treaty at Waitangi was intended to achieve. And it should be celebrated as an example to all Māori of what is possible. Instead, we are becoming increasingly polarised as a nation over how much Māori have suffered as a result of British colonisation. There are strident claims of stolen land and that Te Tiriti was a partnership between Māori and the British Crown, which the British governors subsequently ignored. And this has inevitably created a right-wing backlash, which is just as damaging. Māori are being presented exclusively as warlike Stone Age cannibals who kept slaves and needed the British to rescue them from themselves. Both are examples of sensationalising a partial truth, and it is polarising our nation. In this series of videos, I've attempted to go back to what was recorded about our past and present a more balanced account of what life was really like at the time, including what was agreed when Te Tiriti was signed and what has happened subsequently. This is the foundation of the New Zealand we enjoy today. Te Tiriti was a very simple, clear statement that gave the British Crown overall government of the land, but accepted that each Māori chief would retain his chiefly control over his own hapu, under the overall government by the Crown, much like how local body councils are run today. Māori retained the rights to all their own land, which included the forests and fisheries, unless they willingly agreed to sell to the Crown. And Māori were to have all the rights and responsibilities of British citizens, which would allow Māori to participate in the overall government of the land, just like any other British citizen. This was a partnership, but it was not intended for all Māori chiefs to be in an equal partnership to govern the land with the British Crown. That was ceded in Article 1 of Te Tiriti. Also, there was no difference in intent between Te Tiriti and the subsequent English language version. Each was simply written for a different audience. The simpler Te Tiriti for the Māori chiefs, and the more traditional version for the British Foreign Office and the settlers. This is not what is being presented by the Waitangi Tribunal. It is not being promoted by our politicians, and it is not being taught in our schools and universities. But it is glaringly obvious if you read the instructions given to William Hobson, along with the eyewitness account of the objections raised by the Māori chiefs following the presentation of the treaty at Waitangi. If you haven't done so already, check out my 11th podcast, The Treaty of Waitangi, Drowning in a Sea of Misinformation. It describes this in more detail, including all the references. But why did the Māori Rangatira agree to this? To answer this question, we need to look at what was recorded about Māori life when the Europeans first arrived and in the years that followed. I've covered this in my first podcast, Background to the Treaty of Waitangi. So now let's review some of the key issues. First, let's look at how Māori lived. When the first Europeans arrived in New Zealand, Māori lived in small hapu-based communities. Their dwellings were typically small single-room huts covered in raupo leaves. The entrances were low, and the dirt floors were covered with fern or mats. There would typically be a small fire for warmth in the winter, creating a smoky environment and with no protection from insects or vermin. When the weather permitted, it was more normal to sleep outside, sitting upright and wrapped in a cloak. This continued even after the missionaries arrived and did not begin to improve for most Māori until long after the treaty and the subsequent land wars. By contrast, with the exception of homeless people living in our streets today, which I might add is a separate problem that really needs attention, no Māori lives in conditions like that. Even the most basic housing today is a massive improvement on their life before colonisation. So what about the food they ate? Māori were primarily hunter-gatherers, with some tribes also growing kumara and a few other crops. Europeans then brought crops like potatoes, pumpkins, cabbages and maize, along with fruit trees and protein sources like pigs, cattle and sheep. As hunter-gatherers, Māori needed access to large areas of forests, rivers, swampland and the coastline to collect food. Today, that has been replaced by supermarket shopping, leaving hunting and fishing as sports that we can all enjoy. Again, this is a massive improvement in their lifestyle. So how did Māori treat sickness and wounds? Early Māori were amazingly fit and strong, as necessary for survival when intertribal warfare was the norm. Battle wounds and accidents were the main events requiring medical attention. For these, they relied on their local tauhanga for herbal remedies and incantations. Hot pools and geothermal areas also provided welcome relief for painful wounds. Infectious diseases like influenza, smallpox, mumps, whooping cough, tuberculosis and measles were brought by the Europeans and were devastating for Māori who had no resistance to them. Many died as a result. Likewise, sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis resulted in many deaths. Over time, Māori developed resistance to most of these diseases, and the development of vaccines has been a huge benefit to us all. Today, Māori have full access to our modern health system. Even though it's now labelled as not being culturally sensitive, it is still way, way better than what they had prior to colonisation. And then there is the issue of land. As the Māori population increased following their arrival in New Zealand, competition for land and resources became an issue and resulted in the building of fortified pa's for protection. Inevitably, the strongest tribes would take the best land. The right to live on any land was only determined by a tribe's ability to protect it. Utu for past conflicts and grievances resulted in an ongoing cycle of wars with no end in sight. Slavery and even cannibalism became the norm. The loss of male warriors in the intertribal fighting resulted in too many women for the men who were left. More boy babies were needed, and many girl babies were killed at birth to restore the balance. This was the situation when the first Europeans arrived. It became much worse with the introduction of muskets. The musket wars that began in the mid-1820s only ended with British colonisation. During that time, the combination of intertribal warfare and infectious diseases had reduced the Māori population to around half of what it had been. Now let's look at the impact that the missionaries had. When the missionaries first arrived in 1814, they began teaching Māori to read and write, along with the basic numeracy skills needed for trade. And Māori learned quickly. The missionaries also taught the Christian principle of forgiving your enemies. That took much longer to gain traction, but slowly Māori culture began to change. Customs like self-mutilation, killing slaves, and wives hanging themselves when an important chief died began to fade. Some tribes began to release their slaves and committed to living in peace. But this also created an imbalance where those tribes were faced with others who were still very focused on gaining utu for previous wrongs. The 1820s and 30s were a turbulent 2 decades. And this was compounded by the threat of aggressive colonisation by the French and the arrival of the New Zealand Company in Nelson and Wellington. Prompted by the missionaries, the British government was finally forced to act. So the British Foreign Office commissioned William Hobson to seek agreement from the Māori chiefs for British sovereignty over New Zealand. After some robust debate, Māori agreed to sign the treaty presented to them at Waitangi. Then most other iwi agreed throughout the rest of New Zealand. Many refused to sign because they did not want to be subject to British rule. But in the end, the treaty was accepted and British colonisation began. However, Britain was strapped for cash at that time, and there was no financial resource to get the colony started. It had to pay its own way. There was no budget for law enforcement. There was no budget for schools to bring Māori up to speed. There was no budget for hospitals to care for the sick. Most of this work was done by the missionaries, and there were not enough of them. Some Māori did prosper following the treaty, especially in the Waikato and the Bay of Plenty. Waikato Māori built prosperous farms, flour mills, and exported flour and grain to Australia. But even that collapsed in 1856 when Australia had a bumper harvest in potatoes and wheat. Māori had no experience of dealing with such downturns, and they just walked away from their cultivations when they were not being paid what they expected to receive for their produce. Māori then began to focus on preventing further sale of their land. This led to the King movement in the Waikato and to escalating disputes over land in Taranaki, which ultimately led to the land wars in 1864. Governor Grey's response was to crush the Māori Rebellion and to confiscate land, believing that the only way to prevent further rebellions was to outnumber Māori with so many Pākehā settlers that Māori would finally accept that rebellion was useless. For many years afterwards, Māori was sidelined while the European settlers got on with creating a modern economy. And of course, some Māori also participated and prospered. And we had super talented leaders like James Carroll, Sir Peter Buck and Sir Aparana Ngata, who also participated in government. But they were the minority. So, where have we got to today? It's been a long and tortuous road, but Māori are now in a place where they can choose to live in a traditional communal environment on their own marae, or they can live independently with their Pākehā neighbours. Housing, medical services, freedom from warfare are massive benefits. Driving on a car on a network of roads to anywhere in the country is way better than walking barefoot along forest tracks. Today we take all of this for granted, but many Māori fiercely resisted these developments to begin with. Freedom from intertribal warfare has also allowed Māori the freedom to develop their own culture. While Māori faced decades of rejection from Pākehā and outright racism in towns like Papakura, the Māori language and culture are now flourishing. The whole issue of culture is really important today. We have become a multicultural society, and Māori culture has become an integral part of our identity as a nation. But it is very different from the brutal tikanga at the time of the treaty. It has evolved, and it has been free to evolve into something that we can all enjoy and take a pride in. It can be argued that culture is now more important than race, especially since most Māori whakapapa includes European ancestors. And that is a good thing for us all. In another 100 years, we may all have some Māori ancestors. Then only the culture will be important. So, how do we move forward to create a better future for us all? This has been a very broad brush overview of our history, just enough to provide some balance to the polarizing debates that are going on today. First, we need to acknowledge that these benefits all came because of British colonisation. It wasn't done perfectly. There were injustices. There were times of persecution. Promises weren't always kept. And there are still issues that need to be fixed. But would anyone want to go back to life as it used to be? It's human nature to focus on the negatives, what we have lost or don't have. But that is destructive and only leads to conflict. Real progress comes from working together to solve problems and build a better future. Yes, protect and nourish our different cultures, but always remember we are one people. That was the primary intent of the treaty. One people with different cultures living and working together. We don't need this aggressive polarization that is fracturing our society today. We should be building on the progress that has been made and not tearing it down. We should also approach this positively, recognizing that we are all much better off today. If we can do that, maybe the ugly polarization will fade away and we can get on with sorting out the real problems and creating a better future for us all. Always remember, you can't move forward while you're looking backward. Ngā mihi.